It is such a pleasure to have Sonia Walker, our collaborative keyboardist, with us for this month. Thank you for being here. In the Christian calendar, it's Palm Sunday today. It's the anniversary of Jesus' triumphant entrance into Jerusalem, just days before his betrayal and execution by the state. In the Unitarian Universalist church that I grew up in outside of Boston in the 80s and 90s, I didn't hear very much about this story. I learned it later on. But I'll share it with you in brief. The text of the story is brief, and it's found in all four Gospels. And it goes like this. His disciples get a donkey for him to ride. And you've seen donkeys around. They don't get a donkey for him to ride. They get a donkey for him to ride, right? And they spread some extra clothes on it for a saddle. And he rides, and this chaotic crowd comes with him. They lay branches, they lay their cloaks across the road, sort of makeshift red carpet. And he enters the city as they wave palm branches. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem, seeing the strange parade, ask, "Who is this?" What the gospel writers don't say, any of them, what they would have known so well it didn't even need saying, was that the same day, another parade was about to start on the other side of Jerusalem. It was the week before Passover, and each year Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of that occupied territory, held a military parade. Officers on horseback and fine red cloth bright in the sun, rank on rank of orderly and trained soldiers marching behind, healthy and whole, bright armor shining. One commentator says that each year, this Roman display of might is enacted to intimidate Jews gathering for Passover, which is, after all, the celebration of God's power to free them from a cruel Egyptian tyrant. Pilate's job at Passover is to crush any nascent hope by Jews for another successful rebellion against their present-day occupiers. Rome will keep the peace, but its Pax Romana will be ensured by military domination, by violence, not love or fairness. And lest that point be misunderstood, hundreds of gruesome crosses line the roads into Jerusalem, where rebels or criminals hang as public warning to others. Jesus, or the writers of the gospel, as they told and retold this story in the centuries after Jesus' death, plan Palm Sunday carefully, an act of living theater to make an important point about the choices you and I face. Jesus chooses to enter Jerusalem on a lowly donkey with a cluster of children and adults waving palms. And together they'll shout for joy about a God who heals, who brings peace and forgives, a God who they've seen through Jesus, who they've made real to one another. A new way of life is possible. And the symbols of the parade show that peace can be achieved by nonviolence, by dignity given to all without exception, and by us loving one another abundantly. Two different ways of peacemaking, two different ways of living are contrasted that day in two competing parades on Palm Sunday. And the people of Jerusalem will need to make a choice, and we must also. It is the choice of the kind of life you want to live, the kind of life you're invited into. Which parade will you choose in the daily living of your life? Which will you invite each other into? 2,000 years later, it's easy to imagine the entry into Jerusalem the same way the Romans did, this competing power. Two different visions of who's going to rule the world and be in charge. A rival. that Jesus is someone to displace the empire. It's easy to hear that if the frame of the theology you grew up with, maybe the way you've heard this story in the past, or absorbed through culture, is that Jesus is the king, the ruler, the one who's going to make it all right for us, who's going to overturn the order of things so that now he's on top. But I think all those centuries of obscuring theology hide the real message in that Palm Sunday procession, which is not about him, but about every single person in that parade. He didn't come to do our work for us, but to show, to model, to create, in fact, a way of life that we're all invited into. And that reading is not a recent invention. Unitarians have read the gospel stories this way for centuries, for millennia. Now, on the way into Jerusalem, in Luke's telling of this, Jesus stops to heal a blind man and to welcome in a tax collector to join them. So there's a question, there's like a narrative question here of why. There's like an obvious trajectory to the story. Why stop for this side quest along the way? The authors of Luke wanted to make it absolutely unambiguous that everyone counts and everyone matters. And you're not disqualified from this way of relating to each other because of your body, because of your job, because of your citizenship. Everyone is welcome in the beloved community. It's there in the story because the most important part of the story is not what happens when Jesus gets there. It's how he gets there all the way along. It's what the community does all together in that procession. That parade, it's not an attempt to one-up the Romans. It's not a rebuke or a counter-argument. It is an embodied demonstration that no matter how seductive is the money on display, and no matter how intimidating is the power on display, that those are just not the relevant things about being alive in the world. It's not going for a political coup, but for the establishment of beloved community here, now on earth. That the quality, the experience, the way of living in the world can change. And that transformation starts with what each of us are doing, how we are to one another. And that's the threat. That's the real threat against empire, the threat against status quo. A system of total control that depends on haves and have-nots. A system which depends on some people being outsiders and some people being insiders. Empire depends on enemies. It needs you mad about drag queens. It needs you to remove from school library books which say queer people are human beings. It needs a don't say gay law. That's what empire needs. It needs everything to stay just like it is, and our relationships with one another unchanged. Who gets to be in your parade? Is there room for trans and queer folks to show up exactly as they are? Is there room for any of us and all of us, the hurt and the healing? The status quo wants you numb. It wants you exhausted and overwhelmed. It wants your sense of indignance and injustice channeled elsewhere. The status quo wants you seduced by ambition. The Roman military parade wasn't just a threat, it was aspirational. Healthy horses, strong bodies, beautiful clothes. If you just cooperate a little more, if you work a little harder, if you don't express your doubts, if you exclude the right people, maybe that could be yours also. And if you don't have it all, well, you better carry that as a secret shame. The status quo, that is, wants you to forget the Good Friday reality of suffering and death and live in a Black Friday world. You know Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving? biggest shopping day in the country. We pour time and money and energy and attention and outrage into what we buy that day. The status quo wants you living in a Black Friday world and not a Good Friday world. The status quo says who you are and what you do and where you come from, that matters. It says who you love and how healthy you are, how old you are, how fit you are, how many letters follow your name, what color is your skin, what pronouns do you use, do you look straight enough? And Jesus' real threat to Rome is to say, no, none of that matters. Which parade will you join? Who do you want to be? Ordered wealth and power for some, or beloved messiness for everyone? Right? The beloved community doesn't want you to be the right kind of person for it. It wants to be the community for the person you are right now and the person you're becoming. That procession, that parade celebrates the ludicrous, the subversive notion that everyone counts, everyone matters, full stop. It is an invitation. It's not a prelude to something that comes after. It is the question, which parade will you join? And who gets to join you? Years ago years and years ago now, at a protest, I remember seeing a sign. It was a whiteboard. And on the whiteboard was written, what we have in common. What we have in common is that we are heartbroken. The old story says Jesus goes into Jerusalem knowing he will be betrayed and killed. He knows it and he goes anyways. His parade is joyful, hopeful, sincere, heartfelt, beautiful, and he knows he's going to be killed. It's joyful and heartbroken, both things facing each other. And we retell it here this morning to ourselves, to us, this mixed multitude of Christians and atheists and Buddhists and mystics and humanists. We tell this story because we are not invested in the religion about Jesus. We're invested in the path he was following too, living open-eyed and broken-hearted and deeply in love with this Good Friday world as it is and as it can become. Everything is beautiful. And we are so sad, says the poet. In our heart, it is the first day of spring now, and the forecast is for snow, and we are a people filled with hope. That's who we are. Will you rise in body or in spirit and sing that true?